Well, thank you very much, Rudyard. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Munk Debates. When I was last here a couple of years ago, I just returned from the front line of the war in Ukraine, where I was with the Ukrainian armed forces. And for most of the last 8 months, I've been in Israel and Gaza, following the war there as closely as I can. And I won't go into all the details now that I could give you of what's happening. But I would just put it in perspective in this way, first of all. What happened on the 7th of October was not just a massive attack on innocent people inside Israel. It was the equivalent to about 6,000 Canadians being massacred and burned in their homes in one day. It was the equivalent of about 1,500 of your fellow Canadians being taken hostage. You know, you would have thought after an attack like the one that Hamas instigated, that started this terrible war, you would have thought that there would be some sympathy for the world, from the world. You might have thought the world would pay attention to the attack and at least pay attention to the people behind it. You might have expected, like me, that there might have been a worldwide opposition to the terrorists and rapists and murderers of Hamas. You might have thought there would be hatred around the world erupting at the government of Qatar and its mouthpiece, Al Jazeera, its funding of Hamas and its hosting of the leadership of Hamas in Qatar. You might have thought there'd have been an outpouring of rage at the Islamic Revolutionary Government in Tehran, but no. There was an immediate outpouring of rage against the state that had been attacked. Bring back our girls, we had 10 years ago in the war in northern Nigeria, which I also covered. Bring back our girls. No international campaign saying bring back our Jewish children. Believe all women, we've been told for years. But turns out, not if the raped women are Jews. Israel is the only country in the world which, when it's attacked, gets attacked more. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is, as my late friend Jonathan Sachs said, it's a shape-shifting virus. It moves across the centuries. When you could hate people for their religion, the Jews were hated for their religion. Then you couldn't hate people for that anymore, so people hated the Jews for their race. And then after the 20th century, people realized that wasn't such a great idea either. Now, the Jews are hated not for their religion or their race, but for having a state. People around the world hate them so much for it that Israelis are attacked when they have hostages taken, and this is to remember the 100 hostages still in captivity in Gaza, who, if they were given back by Hamas today, the war would be over. And they're also attacked when they rescue their hostages. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is the Jews can never win, because historically they've been hated for being rich and for being poor. They've been hated for integrating and for not integrating. They were hated for being stateless. Remember, rootless cosmopolitans, the far right used to say. And now they're hated for having a state. Today, the only really acceptable form of anti-Semitism, aside from the sewers of the far right, the only real tolerated form of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. And Zionism, as we just heard, is simply the right of the Jews to self-determination in their historic homeland. That's all. Anti-Semitism, as we've also just heard, is double standards against Jewish people, or cruel and unfair treatment of people because they're Jews. This isn't very far away from home here. If this isn't anti-Semitism, can the audience here tell me why the following things have happened since October the 7th? Why in a Montreal suburb a synagogue should be firebombed, as happened in November? Why there should have been gunshots against the yeshiva? Why in Toronto a bookstore owned by a Jew should be attacked? why a Molotov cocktail was thrown through a Jewish community center in Montreal, why a Toronto Jewish deli in North York was firebombed, why in Toronto the Orthodox synagogue was vandalized, why in Toronto 2 men opened fire the other week on a Jewish girls' school. If it isn't anti-Semitism, tell me why just a week ago, pro-Hamas protesters tried to go through Jewish areas in this city shouting, not just Allahu Akbar, but, and I quote, sorry for the language, fucking Zionist pigs, dirty Zionist rats. Have you heard that language before? The Jews have. Now look, if you are interested in this motion, just bear this in mind. It's not about Netanyahu, it's not about this war, it's about double standards. And one question hovers over it above all, the question of who would protect the Jews. Who would you trust to protect them? The Europeans? The Arab world? No. History shows only one people will protect the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That's what Zionism is. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's quite a lot to reply to there. Let me first say, Gideon, you started with a peroration about me not mentioning the Palestinian casualties. That's because I started by mentioning the war, and there is no law of war that says you're allowed to start a war and then complain when you lose it. And if Mehdi cares about the Palestinian casualties, as I'm sure he does, then tell your bosses in Qatar to tell their friends in Gaza to stop the war and give back the hostages. Gideon says Israel needs nothing more than criticism. As if Israel doesn't get criticism. Wow, he doesn't even read his own country's press. By the way, you said the other day in an interview, Gideon, I couldn't care less about the Jewish state, so we know very well where you're coming from. Let me just say a couple of things about that I didn't get to in my opening remarks, but are important. You know, if you didn't throng the streets of this city or any other for the actual genocide going on in Sudan, not the one that Mehdi and Gideon pretend is happening, but the actual genocide going on in Sudan, if you didn't spend weekend after weekend doing that, but you did come out for the post-October the 7th protests, you're an anti-Semite. If, like Mehdi once sent a tweet condemning that, it doesn't give you quite enough smoke cover. You know, if you protested not a bit, didn't set up a tent when Bashar al-Assad was killing 6 times the number of people in a decade that Israel and all of its enemies have lost in 75 years of war, you are an anti-Semite. And I would just add one other thing. I know that Mehdi has tried to reframe the motion. I'm not going to allow it either. You know, maybe there is somebody in the world. Pakistan was invented, created as a state around the same time as Israel. I reckon that if this debate tonight was about Pakistan, Pakistan started a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of casualties, caused a lot of casualties. But you know what? If somebody said, I think Pakistan should be abolished. They just don't have the right to a state, and although they had one set up for them many decades ago, we should abolish it. I think people would say, And then if the person said, but, oh, by the way, although I want to abolish that state, I have no problem with the Pakistani people. Please, please, of course you would.
Calibrate for us your understanding of Zionism.
Let me just reiterate, because we started this debate with a definition put up behind us on the screens, and however much Mehdi and Gideon want to reframe it, it's quite straightforward. Zionism, I repeat, is the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland. Anti-Semitism is cruel double standards towards Jews and cruel and unfair treatment of them as Jews. When I mean, I wish I could say I'm amazed by what Gideon has said, but I recently watched your interview on Al Jazeera where you said that when the interviewer said to you, how many people in Israel agree with you? And you said you could fit them in a phone box. And that's true. That is absolutely true. You are as obscure a figure in Israeli society as it's possible to find. And I'll give you an example of why. Natasha just picked Mehdi up on an important lie. You could say it's just an elision or a mistake he made because he hadn't read the primary sources, but I cannot allow Gideon to get away with what he just said, which was an unbelievable lie. He said, Israel isn't a democracy. First of all, I don't know, maybe, have you ever been there?
Yes.
When?
A few years ago, not recently. I don't get awards from the president of Israel like you do, so I don't get to do softball interviews.
Well,
I didn't get invited into Gaza. Douglas, you said in your speech.
Let me finish my point.
But you went to Gaza, right? You said you went to Gaza. How come you went to Gaza when the world's media is not allowed into Gaza?
There's two reasons.
But they took you into Gaza.
Well, first of all, I'll explain, but let me pick up my point since you keep trying to derail me. There are two ways to go into Gaza. One is with the IDF, which is what I did and what most Western journalists have done. The other is to go in with Hamas. You could probably go in with Hamas. I can't. Secondly, so you see, if I was on stage tonight busily flying around the world to busily defame a democracy, I would spend a bit of time there, Mehdi. I would spend a bit of time there because everything you said about it, like Gideon, is totally untrue. And I'll just give one other thing. Gideon said an appalling thing just there, that this is not about annihilation. One of the heads of Hamas, 2012, kill them all the Jews, don't leave a single one. Ismail Haniyeh, 2017, children are tools to be used against Israel, we'll sacrifice them for them. Yahya Sinwar, who planned the 7th, we will take down the border with Israel and tear their hearts out from their bodies. I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, from what I've seen, which you scorn because you are an armchair journalist. I'll tell you what I've seen. When Yahya Sinwar said that we want to rip the hearts out of the Jews, it wasn't rhetoric. They did it. They mean it, and only this side wants to pretend they don't, for whatever reasons a psychologist would have to explain.
Okay, sorry, he called me. Let me respond. Let's do this.
I want to see if all four of you can work with me to work through.
Where it says that a young generation has been lied to in significant numbers, and with a sense of ferocity and extremism, which we should all abhor. I mean, it's possible that these college campus kids didn't get the memo from the other side in their desperate attempt not only to reframe anti-Zionism, but also anti-Semitism. It's very strange to me, isn't it, that if anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitic, why do all these kids who've never protested about anything else before in the world stage suddenly turn up at Columbia and chase Jewish students with "go back to Poland" or Ukraine? Why is it Jewish students at universities here in Toronto and Montreal who get chased by mobs and shouted down by mobs screaming anti-Semitic slurs? They're not even bothering to cover over it. I mean, they very rarely anymore remember to say, "Oh, I meant Zionist." They're revealing themselves all the time, and it's because first of all, they've been lied to. Secondly, there are a very large number of them who are, I would say that they fall into two categories, the sinister and the silly. The sinister are the ones who know exactly which river they're chanting about and exactly which sea. And they want the eradication of the world's only Jewish state. And they think they're the good guys. The silly, they're the ones who, like there was a guy at Columbia who started this academic year calling for climate emergency, and then Hamas attacked Israel, and suddenly he was for Hamas. He has a sort of belly button piercing, and I think he's queers for Palestine, or as I say, chickens for KFC. And these students are, I'll put it straight, they are They are desperate for a cause. They're desperate for meaning in their lives. They have searched and scoured the land looking for meaning and purpose, and instead of learning something good to do with their lives, they've decided they will do this incredibly simplistic thing. Everything in the world is oppressor, oppressed, occupier, occupied, colonizer, colonized. And this incredibly simplistic idea that works nowhere, they then implant or try to implant over the world's most complex region. And they think in doing so that they're being good guys. And what they don't realize is that if they got what they wanted, they'd have finished the work of Adolf Hitler. First of all, again, nobody on this side has said or would say that if you criticize any politician in Israel or any action of the Israeli government, you are therefore an anti-Semite. Neither of us said that at any point. Secondly, at no point on this side have we said that this is a zero-sum game between the Israelis and the Palestinians or the Israelis and the Arabs. There is no reason why a Jewish state should not be able to live side by side with another Arab-Palestinian state. Okay? And I'm glad that Gideon brought up Oslo, the only reason that there is not a Palestinian state today, not the Palestinian Authority, which runs most of the West Bank, or Hamas, that was given the Gaza and then decided to do, well, we know what they decided to do with 18 years of international funding from this country and others. Not that, but if they were given another state, there is no reason, if they brought their children up to love life and to live by their neighbors, if they educated their children into learning instead of hate, there is no reason why they could not live in a state beside a Jewish state. And there's no reason why Zionism opposes that. And it doesn't. But once again, Gideon and Mehdi said something without giving you the context. You said that when Israel was involved in Oslo, the world loved it. Well, we all have our different histories and interpretations of that, I'm sure. Maybe it just looks better in the rearview mirror. The reality is that the Oslo process massively changed Israel. Why? Because the Israeli public and their politicians went for peace and they got intifada. They went for peace and they got suicide bombers at nightclubs in Tel Aviv. And one reason why Gideon is such an extremely rare voice in Israel, and congratulations, Mehdi, you know the drill, you can always find a Jew on your side who'll support what you do. But the reason why Gideon is such an unusual voice in Israel is because most Israelis learned from that intifada what it means, what the teaching of hate to Palestinian children means, and now, after October the 7th, they've learned it 1,000-fold. The people who were killed in the communities beside Gaza were people who dreamed of peace just as much as you do, if not more. And I can tell you that of the young people dancing at the Nova party that night, that morning, the young people dancing at that party massacred, raped, shot, kidnapped for the crime of dancing. There's not one of those kids who didn't dream of the day they could dance with their Palestinian brothers and sisters. Again, you should do the reporting yourself, Mehdi. I've seen the maps on the bodies of the terrorists. I've seen, for instance, the one of the bodies of the terrorists. Well, no, you're just trying to make a cheap debating point again.
No, it's called a fact.
Let me make the point, which instead of you making your cheap debating point, is a fact which you should think of imbibing. Just stop it for a moment, Mehdi, and listen.
Please, go. Come on. Give us your facts.
I'll give you one example. The terrorists who came into Ofakim, which is many miles from the border, on the bodies of the 12 terrorists who made it into that settlement, into that community there in Ofakim, I have seen the map on the body of at least one of the terrorists, and it had on the map the house of a member of the Knesset who lived there, the house where the synagogue was going to be because it was a holy day, and the kindergarten. Now, I'll give you one other example. In Near Oz, excuse me, because you lied again. Because you lied again and pretended that what Natasha just said was not the case. And I'm telling you,
what Shin Bet says.
No, you're not, Mehdi.
As
usual, you're making a cheap point for your partisan reasons. And I am telling you,
You've accused me of being Hamas, but I'm the chief debater.
I have seen the precise maps
Douglas,
of the communities
I'm afraid
I am more reliable than you and your bosses in Qatar.
You're not, Douglas. Oh, my boss is in Qatar, not chief debater.
Very much. Quite a lot of heat, some light. We set out this evening defining what both these terms were, and they are defined for you. Anti-Semitism is a cruel treatment, double standards applied to Jews. Anti-Zionism is a movement that believes that the Jews don't have the right to a state in their historic homeland. And as I said at the beginning, anti-Semitism is a shapeshifter. It does come from all sorts of directions, and Mehdi is right. As I mentioned at the beginning, it can come from the far right, it can come from the far left. But at the moment, what we see an eruption of is anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism. What else is it that is motivating the crowds? Why, when I was in Vancouver the other month, were there crowds going down the street in Vancouver screaming about Israel? What's it got to do with them? You're miles away. It's got absolutely into the brains of people in the West who believe they're doing something moral, and they are imbibing every anti-Semitic trope, as Natasha has proven. I should say, since Mehdi was honest, I'll say what I think. I think he's a very dishonest actor. A very dishonest actor. And to say what you just said about hostages would come a lot better if a contributor to Al Jazeera had not been discovered last week holding a hostage in his home. It would be a lot easier to take. And finally, I just want to say this. It's perfectly obvious, I said at the beginning, that you can get anti-Semitism from all directions. This just happens to be the major direction which is coming in at the moment, in the guise of anti-Zionism. As I said, does everybody who is doing this know what they're doing? No. Almost certainly not. Do some of them? Oh, you bet. They're having a whale of a time. People like those people I mentioned marching last week through Jewish areas of Toronto, getting to scream about the pigs and the rats again. Wow, it feels good to them. Does everyone know what they're doing? No. But when you hear Gideon saying that, what did you say earlier? That Israel is the most brutal regime in the world, you can have traveled nowhere, sir. And there is no reason, as I said at the beginning of this tonight, why simply recognizing that the anti-Zionism of today is anti-Semitism should be any barrier to there being some kind of peace settlement at some point. But please understand that those of us who recognize that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is because we see, after a mass slaughter of Jews, the world turning on the one Jewish state. That is what we see and what we worry about, and what some people like Mehdi seem not to care about, and all of the smears and all of the lies that they get to pump out. But I've got good news for you, ladies and gentlemen, to finish. I hope very much that you vote the right way tonight, obviously. And it matters for Canada and its image. But the Jewish state and the Jewish people have survived an awful lot worse than this. They have seen off every single one of their enemies, from Pharaoh to the Abyssinians, to the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans. They will see off Hamas, they will see off Mehdi, and they will outlive everybody in this room.